Hello everybody, my name is Jason Pepper from the version 1 SAM practice. I'm here this afternoon with a colleague of mine to talk to you about virtualization and Oracle licensing. So let me introduce myself. I've been working in Oracle licensing now for since 2006, and prior to that I worked for Oracle themselves in a technical role. So I've been in and around the Oracle infrastructure for a very long time. I spend most of my time nowadays working on contracts and software asset management from a generic perspective. And from an Oracle specific perspective, I'm joined by my colleague Paul Bullen. So Paul's going to introduce himself now. Hi, Paul.
Thanks, Jason, and hi everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm an Oracle Principal License Consultant for version 1. I've been working in Oracle licensing since about 2001. My background is as a DBA, so my nature is quite technical. But these days, of course, in order to do Oracle licensing, I find myself working on commercial, contractual, behavioral aspects as well as the technical side, in order to help customers get the best out of their Oracle license assets.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. So the topic that we want to discuss, virtualization as a technology, been around for a very long time, and Oracle's approach to virtualization has been relatively kind of consistent. Their take on it is certainly one that's resulted in quite a lot of conversation around in the licensing world. So if you were to kind of sum that up, Paul, how would you say that Oracle's approach to virtualization? What is that approach?
Well, these days, invariably, when people ask us a question about Oracle licensing on virtualized environments, it's predominantly about VMware. So you're right, virtualization has been around for a long time, been applicable to IBM for a very, very long time. 99% of the conversations we have these days are about VMware. So most of my answers today are going to be sort of couched in that sort of context. It's a very hot topic, and there's a lot of confusion and a lot of sort of myths out there as well. And people still have an understanding which may be sort of behind the times, because they may have gone through an audit 5-10 years ago. They might not know what today's rules are. So in a nutshell, the way that Oracle treat licensing on VMware these days is, because you have the ability to move a virtual machine around a VMware environment, and there's no boundaries to that these days because of the technology that VMware offers you. In essence, that means you need to license every single ESX VMware physical host you have in your environment. So it doesn't matter whether you put them in a cluster, or you use a sort of host affinity rules, or you put them in a dedicated vCenter even. Because VMware offers you the ability to move that virtual machine around, Oracle say, well, that potential means you need to license every single host. That comes as quite a big surprise to people, so they might try and put some sort of safeguards in place, but those safeguards are not recognized by Oracle. Oracle are pretty clear when in an audit situation to say, those aren't our rules. We don't recognize any isolation you put in place, so you need to license everything.
Wow, that's quite an encompassing policy.
Yeah, and it's a very hot topic, as you can imagine. I've had about 3 or 4 conversations with customers about that just in the last couple of days. We're talking about it all the time, and it's fair to say everyone who's new to that policy kind of rubs their eyes and goes, "What? What does that actually mean for my estate?" And it generally means bills of hundreds of millions of pounds, dollars, whatever, very, very quickly, depending on the products that are being used.
Mm. It seems to me that that's a relatively, I don't know, I would call it an old school approach. I mean, if you were to approach that today, it would seem to me to make sense that you should license it based on the virtual host rather than the physical host. Would that be a sensible conclusion, you think?
Yeah, I think it would be. It's fair to say, and I use this line quite a lot when I'm talking to customers about this particular policy, that common sense, frankly, gets left behind sometimes when thinking about how to count these things. What's originally happened here is about 10 years ago, when more and more people started virtualizing, because Oracle licenses technology processor based, they're based on the size of the CPU allocation to a particular workload. As people consolidated big legacy boxes onto fewer physical ESX hosts, and managed to squeeze the CPUs in those and get better value out of them, rather than having boxes sat idle, that ultimately meant that Oracle sold less license.
Right.
So you get more out of your license by squeezing one particular piece of tin up to near 100% CPU utilization, rather than having 10 boxes sat at about 10-15% utilization. So Oracle saw a threat to your revenues as people consolidated more. And back in the day, as VMware was sort of first being adopted and introduced, Oracle sort of, I think, saw this as a problem, and then thought, well, this is not really fair. People are going to consolidate and make a lot of savings, and therefore we need to find a way to make sure that we're sort of protecting ourselves here and not losing out too much. And that originally manifested as something that was fairly sensible, so people would logically segregate their workloads into clusters. Your Oracle databases all sit together, you don't mix them with any other workloads, and you license on the basis of cluster. And everyone was kind of happy with that. It seemed fair. Your workloads might move around between the nodes in the cluster, and that was all sort of logical, plausible, and felt pretty fair. However, because that's based on the ability to migrate a workload around, as the functionality of VMware has evolved, so Oracle have had to sort of keep their rules in step. And they've had to sort of change that and say, well, actually now VMware 5.1 to 5.5 allows you to migrate between clusters. We need to change our policy on that basis as well. The sort of slightly disturbing thing about all of this is that none of this is actually written down for customers to digest, to understand, or to sort of comprehend and sit down and come up with a strategy on actually even how to count or license on that basis. People usually find out in an audit situation or by sort of Googling and hoping they get a good source for this information.
Right. Wow, that sounds complicated. So is it these rules? Do we see them in the contracts that people buy nowadays?
No, they never have made any sort of entrance or appearance in the contracts as they've evolved over the years. That there's, unless someone has specifically asked for a particular clause to explain how they might count or isolate VMware, it's not included in a contract. It's not part of the standard terms and conditions. The only reference Oracle make to it anywhere, which is somewhere you can sort of go and find it as a customer, is in the hard partitioning document. But even that is limited. So
right.
The word VMware is mentioned once there, and it quite simply says it's soft partitioning. It doesn't talk about clustering. It doesn't talk about vCenters or migration or the difference between different versions of VMware. And crucially, at the bottom of that document, it says this document is not contractual. It's for educational purposes only. So that document could change at any point, and it isn't referenced from anyone's contract.
Wow. So what kind of problems does that present for customers on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think there's a lot of hesitancy from customers even now to adopt VMware. So their technology choices, their ability to run their enterprises and their estates in the most efficient way are kind of being set by this policy, or people being very wary of this policy. And like I said, this isn't sort of clarified in any documentation for people to go and read and understand and come up with a particular policy for it. And I guess there's also a reluctance for people to pick up the phone to their Oracle account managers and say, look, we're wanting to consider VMware here. Is that a good idea? How do we count it? So again, people sort of rely on what they've heard in the industry, what they might have seen in previous organizations, and just go, this is too much risk for us. We're not going to go to it, and sort of avoid VMware. For those who don't, and for those who sort of proceed with VMware, they either find out when they're being audited what the implications are, or the ones who are more diligent will speak to an independent expert and find out, what the options are available to them. And there's a few options that customers can take in this sort of situation, and there's no one answer that suits every single customer.
Right. Okay. So I guess one of the questions I should ask you really is, what are the things that people can do? I mean, just before we do that though, does this virtualization policy affect all Oracle software, or is it just a database?
It's in essence any technology product, anything such as database middleware or WebLogic type products, anything which is licensed on a processor metric, or usually a named user plus metric, which has a bearing or connection to the processor metric underneath it. So applications products aren't affected by this, but the underpinning database will be.
Right. Okay. So that would mean middleware or any other form of kind of technology that's based on processor licensing. So that could have a huge potential impact, right?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, up until fairly recently, people have been able to sort of logically understand that and to say, well, we'll come up with some way to segregate our workloads. We know our databases sit there, we know our WebLogic sits there, and that's fine. Even more recently, things have just been exacerbated by Java, because of course Java is licensed on a processor metric as well. And people don't consolidate Java workloads in the same way they consolidate database or middleware sort of workloads. And so this sort of reconsideration of how to count in VMware has really kind of come to the forefront recently when people are considering Java, because it's just across everyone's estate and it is already on VMware, so you can't even really avoid the problem with Java.
Right. So does the I mean, we're mentioning VMware here, right? But does that policy also affect other virtualization technologies? I mean, because there are obviously other people in the market. There's Red Hat, Oracle themselves have a virtualization technology. Microsoft have a virtualization technology. Which ones does this policy affect? Does it affect them all the same way?
I'll be honest with you. The vast majority of people are talking about VMware these days. But the theory is that it all comes down to the capability of your particular virtualization and the ability to migrate your workloads around. So if your virtualization technology has similar sort of functionality to VMware and you can do that, then you should apply the same sort of rules. So it's strictly speaking not technology specific, it's more capability specific. But a lot of the other virtualization mechanisms don't have the same rich features that VMware have.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. The strategies for limiting exposure.
One is not really a strategy at all, and it doesn't limit your exposure. It's just to follow Oracle's rule and say it is what it is, and we'll just take that into consideration and either avoid VMware entirely, or every time we deploy a new ESX host into our environment, we'll license that for all the Oracle workloads we have on VMware. So not really a strategy, but I guess that's the default position before you think about it. There's sort of two middle options, which are putting some mechanism in place to isolate your workloads. And Oracle do provide this guidance to customers in certain situations, when there's particularly good relationships, or where there's a sort of incentive to get something else done and to have clarity on VMware. And at that point, Oracle will sort of agree with the customer. If you put this sort of segregation in place, it's usually network and storage, and they want to get a proper technical understanding of that. If you put that in place and we ratify it, then you can use that to limit your license requirements. And so, again, you'd have a logical separation. It might be a cluster, and then you'd have other mechanisms behind that sort of clustered environment to stop migration of workloads outside that environment.
Right.
So that works quite well until something crops up outside that cluster. Java, again, is a great example there. You're going to have something which appears outside that cluster. As soon as that happens, you're back to the sort of first default position again. So it requires maintenance, it requires effort from the customer to keep on top of that. And it also requires Oracle to sort of sanction or ratify that in their eyes. The slight twist on that is some people will go through the sort of effort of isolating and putting these mechanisms in place, but they won't necessarily proactively go to Oracle. They might wait for an audit before they approach Oracle and say, we've already done some segregation, are you all right with that? And they'll not do it proactively. So that's sort of two flavors of the same sort of option. The final option is one which is, shall we say, robust, is again not for everyone. But that's basically to say the VMware policy, the hard partitioning document, is not contractual. We read our contract. We know what our contract says. We're comfortable with what our contract says we need to count. And on that basis, we'll just count per processor. And we'll ignore this VMware policy because we can't see why we have to abide by something that's non-contractual. Like I say, that's a pretty robust stance. It requires a full understanding. It needs sign off internally. It needs legal input. It's not to be an option to be chosen lightly. But some customers are going for that, especially again because of Java these days.
Right. So if I was to summarize that, essentially there's the pay for everything, follow the policy, pay for everything. have a strategy for segregation, which you've kind of discussed up front and agreed. Have a strategy for segregation, which you wait until audit to get agreed, or take the kind of commercial contractual view that actually it's not in the contract, therefore you don't need to abide by it. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, spot on.
And do you know of any organizations that have kind of taken the latter stance and been successful in that?
Yeah, I think we first saw that being used and sort of counseled the customer who chose that particular policy probably as early as 2015, 2016. And we've seen many customers do it since then. So the way we sort of talk customers through it is to lay out those options, walk them through them all, and sort of point to their specific contract, and let them sort of make their own informed decision, like I say, with counsel, with internal approvals, etc., etc. It does, like I say, require a sort of strong position if they ever get an audit. But again, we have seen people go through audit with that stance as well. Needless to say, it doesn't get a favorable response from Oracle. There's a lot of pushback from Oracle. But ultimately, there's no obligation for a customer to release all that information about VMware to Oracle in an audit situation.
Right. Wow. That's a very interesting piece of information. I hadn't realized. Yeah. So would we say those are our top tips? Are there any other top tips that we can kind of give people as a parting shot?
I think it's a shame if people have the technology dictated to them by a non-contractual policy. Obviously, people should be aware of the approaches that Oracle would take, and they should be fully informed as to what would happen in the event of audit and what could happen. But also, I think people need to be aware of their own choices that they can make as well. And so once someone has gone through the process of sitting down, taking some time, getting the appropriate inputs from around their organization, coming with their own internal policy, if you like, and backing that up with contractual text behind it, then once people have sat down and taken that time, people shouldn't be afraid to adopt these other technologies if that suits their business at the end of the day. They're still putting a license in place for the Oracle software. It just may not be for the potential to run a piece of software somewhere.
Right. Okay. Wow. Well, that's been fascinating. I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us today, Paul. Now, I know that obviously some of the topics that we've discussed here are complicated, and that there's obviously a lot more collateral available, on the version 1 website and on the wider internet as well. But I think certainly from if I was an audience member listening to this, I would be interested in following up on that. And if I was wanting to do that, I could take advantage of this. Version 1 we understand that this is a complicated topic, and if what you've heard today has kind of piqued your interest and made you feel that you want to know more about it, we'd be more than happy to provide any of the attendees and listeners to this webinar to attend a 1-hour complimentary license consultation session. All you need to do is click on the link in this screen video or visit it on your web browser, and we'll be able to follow up and open up a dialogue with you. So thanks for your time, for listening, and thanks, Paul, for your time and for your contribution. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Nice to speak to you.